Can you say hi?
Hi.
Hi. We're back. We had a little delay because we had a little injury. This little one here fell off her rocking horse and hurt her neck. You want to show everybody your boo-boo? Your neck? Yeah, she fell. So here we are again. We're back. I'm going to wait a second or two for people to get back on. Awesome. Waiting. Can you say hi? Say hi to Mommy's friends. Hi, Mommy's friends. All right, so we're back to discuss the next part of The Body Keeps the Score. Hey, Carrie. And we're on chapters 9 and 10, and it's continuing the childhood trauma section. So part 3, the minds of children. And this is the last set of chapters that's specifically dealing with childhood abuse and trauma. And so the next time we meet together, we'll switch over to the next part, the imprint of trauma. So I'm waiting for a couple other people to hop on. Okay, so we're going to finish talking about that. You ready? And I'm going to try to be a little cryptic since I have a partner here. Speaking of childhood trauma and living in a pandemic, I've been trying to figure out how to balance, I don't know about you, balance work with motherhood. And these two were sending me a strong signal that they needed their mama. So we took a break this afternoon. Okay, do you think you could go play now? Yeah, okay. Okay, so looking at chapter 8, chapter 9 is What's Love Got to Do with It? Can you sit back, honey, so Mommy can see? What's love got to do with it? And this chapter actually the next 2 chapters talk a lot about the importance of really knowing the root of what's going on with kids, and how there's currently not a diagnosis for childhood trauma. And so people who are suffering various kinds of illnesses or receive different kinds of mental diagnoses, it often stems back to their childhood trauma. So these 2 chapters talk a lot about that. So he says that, diagnosis informs treatment, and there was some discussion on our Facebook page yesterday about that, about the purpose of a diagnosis and the treatment that you receive because of a diagnosis. And he says that a lot of times people who have suffered childhood trauma, and we're talking like early childhood trauma, that they often will be diagnosed as bipolar or borderline personality disorder. He talks a lot about borderline personality disorder in chapter 9, but how that misdiagnosis can have really negative effects, because it might treat a problem for a little bit, but it's not actually treating the source or the root of what happened to these adults that made them, exhibit the symptoms that they have as adults. So what he did was he and another scientist or psychiatrist put together something called the TAC, or the Traumatic Antecedents Questionnaire. So it's this long series of questions that helps to uncover what happened to someone, their underlying trauma, because as he said in the previous chapters, and we'll continue to say, honey, be very careful with that. It's going to fall. It's okay. You can leave it. Thank you. Please don't pull it any closer. Okay, thank you. But people aren't going to just sit down with you and say, yeah, I was abused and let me tell you what happened. Normally when someone hasn't been able to process that trauma yet, they're not going to come right out with that. And so they came up with a lot of questions that start really basic, like, where do you live? All the way up to different things like, who in your family was affectionate to you? Who made you feel safe? There's a lot of questions between where did you live growing up and where do you live now, to who made you feel safe growing up. There's a lot of questions in between, but then they start digging deeper into, who made the rules at your house, how are you punished or kept in line, and eventually these questions will begin to kind of crack open into more, kind of open up the lid, so that more things begin to come up and the trauma begins to surface. Anyway, he says that a lot of the things that show up in bipolar personality disorder are disassociation, desperate clinging to whoever might be enlisted to help. These behaviors begin, he says on page 142, ways of dealing with overwhelming emotions and inescapable brutality. Then this is what was astounding. Statistics like stand up to me as something, that speaks, and I think that's what this book talks a lot about, is like research and statistics are important, and you don't get a diagnosis or attention or funding unless you have a lot of statistics and research behind what it is that you're trying to draw attention to. So sometimes that's good, sometimes it's bad. He says that 81% of the patients diagnosed with with BPD, not bipolar, I'm sorry. Thank you.
Mommy, can I have a banana?
Can you have a banana? Yes, you can have a banana. Can you crack the door? Thank you. But 81% of the people who had borderline personality disorder, sorry, not bipolar, that they had been abused. They had a severe history of child abuse and neglect, and most of those cases, the majority, began before age 7. So they're again talking about that early childhood being really, really important to the way a person relates to their world growing up, and the way a person can function as a social being in the world. He says that their research supports that, when kids they fear abandonment, then because of this, they're always going to fear abandonment. When they're filled with rage, it's usually because they were rejected or treated harshly. When they have inner conflicts regarding their feelings, about angry feelings in particular, it's because they weren't allowed to express those feelings growing up. Then he goes on into the part that I found really, really, really interesting. And that's when he was talking about self-harm. I'm gonna take you with me and close my door. So he said that people who experience certain kinds of self-destructive behaviors don't always remember why, or the root of, why they're doing this thing. And he says that those folks, though, when you interview them, will often say that they didn't remember feeling safe with anybody as a child. They reported being abandoned or, going from place to place to place and left alone. And he said, that all this made him begin to think that the safety and that feeling of security was really important. But the interesting thing is kids who can remember, or adults who can remember as kids, having at least a person that made them feel safe, that those feelings of safety could be reactivated, so that they would be able to kind of restore that sense of safety in their adult relationships. But if there was no deep memory of that, the receptors in the brain that respond to kindness might not work. It might actually fail. So again, that early childhood being super, super, super important. All right. Then he begins to talk about labels, and he talks about how adults, I think we touched on this a little bit before, adults who'd been abused as children often have trouble concentrating, they're on edge, they've got self-loathing, all of these things that that lead to a certain diagnosis or certain label, but they also have large gaps in their memories, they engage in self-destructive behavior and a bunch of other things, can't navigate in intimate relationships, And he said that this is something that's not present, or it's very rarely present in people who have PTSD from natural disasters. So he later on begins to talk about how these three groups. You have people who have PTSD from like war and single events, like single traumatic events, like war. Even though, I mean, you can argue that's not a single event, but single event is relative. It could be like, going into combat for a period of time, or being witness to a school shooting or something like that. It could be, so that's one group. So like this event, one big trauma thing, natural disasters, and then people who suffered trauma as children. And he said that the way that plays out is different, and it's much. The brain development is really different, and being able to treat people is really different when they've experienced childhood abuse. He said that there's not a condition, there's not a label for childhood abuse. So in the next chapter, he begins to talk about the importance of trying to develop like a diagnosis or a label that I would actually, where you could actually put a code for, or a label on someone who had experienced severe childhood trauma or abuse, either physical or emotional, psychiatric abuse. And he describes this journey. He describes the research of it. He decides like getting something in front of important people and then it getting shut down, and how that's really awful. So again, he talks a lot about the diagnostic system in the DSM and how the DSM really fails victims of abuse and neglect. And my question, and I'm wondering, I'm trying to kind of watch the comment section to see if anybody says anything, but one thing I wondered is do we not have a diagnosis for that because it is so hard and complex, or is it because there's also like this emotional, complex, emotional, deep sadness that is attached to that? I can imagine like treating or listening to or providing an ear for and help to someone who is a victim of a couple of these other things, and maybe I understand it and maybe I don't. I've not lived through a hurricane that's ruined my home, yet I live in a place where a lot of people have, and I can't understand that, but I can listen and be a helper in that way because I can remove myself from it. I also happen to live in a place where oh, thank you, Rhonda. Rhonda posted a link about DSM changes to trauma stress related disorders. Thank you, because this book is a few years old, so that helps. And I live near a military base, and so again, I can't understand that military, that trauma from war and things like that, but I can listen to it and attend to it. But for me personally, to talk about childhood trauma, that's hard, because things start triggering and flaring for me. And I just wonder if we have such a large percentage of people who've been abused and either can't remember it or don't talk about it or whatever. Is it possible that somewhere like deep within us, one of the reasons we don't want to give a label, or kind of resist giving a label, is that it stirs some things up for us too that we don't want to stir up? I don't know. That's just me spitballing. It was a question I wrote in the margins for myself. All right. Rhonda says there are other related diagnoses, but the developmental traumatic disorder that he's trying to get implemented is still not one of these diagnoses. So that's really helpful. Thank you, Rhonda. Okay. All right. So I'm going to try to speed up a little bit. I thought one thing that was really interesting, and I've heard some other people talk about, is when he does the case study of the people who are morbidly obese and how a lot of those people have childhood trauma, and specifically like sexual childhood trauma. So eating and having a larger body is a self-protective thing. It's a way that they protect themselves, like actually physically protect themselves. And how this is something that wasn't recognized for a while. And then he begins to kind of argue that sometimes maybe trying to treat something like obesity when you're not looking at the underlying reasons might actually make something worse. So he talks about this woman who was obese, who went into a program, lost a lot of weight, and then became attractive to this man, and he started to suggest like that they engage in a sexual relationship, and she responded by beginning to eat a lot and gained a lot of weight. And then they realized it was a coping mechanism. It was a way of being safe. And then some time passed, and she had a surgery so that she would lose weight. And after she had the surgery, I believe she attempted suicide. Like, she began to hurt herself. And he said sometimes there are certain things like eating and cigarettes and different things that we may try to, for lack of a word, cure people of or help them not to do, which may actually cause them a whole lot less harm to do those things than to try to deal with their trauma in other ways. So if that makes sense, like smoking might be okay if it's keeping you from causing yourself self-harm by doing really hard drugs. I've definitely had experience with that with someone I love, where certain other habits that are otherwise unhealthy increased, but the habits that could actually kill in the short term were stopped. So if that makes sense. And I just thought that was really interesting. And he said, incidents of abuse are never a standalone thing. Every time there's abuse, there's and then there's more abuse, that the toll and the damage becomes bigger and bigger and higher. All right. Looking in the comments here. Yeah. Okay. So Rhonda's talking about poor parenting. I think we can get to that pretty soon. Yeah. So quickly, before we switch to talking about parenting, he says that the behaviors that people exhibit, so doing this adverse childhood experiences study where you ask a series of questions, and for everything that's traumatic there's a point that happens. And he says that at a certain point, like the more points you have, the more likely, I think I'm getting this right, that you're going to engage in high-risk behaviors later. He says the list of high-risk behaviors predicted by the ACE score include smoking, obesity, unintended pregnancies, multiple sexual partners. The list goes on and on and on and on. And he says that those with an ACE score of 6 or above had a 15% or greater chance than those with an ACE score of 0 of currently suffering from any of the 10 leading causes of death in the U.S., including chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, ischemic heart disease, liver disease. And they were twice as likely to suffer from cancer, 4 times as likely to have emphysema, and the ongoing stress on the body keeps taking its toll. So that was huge, right? Like, he's not only talking about relationship problems and depression and a lot of the things that we've been talking about in the book, but also these other huge health problems that kill people. It's just, it keeps stacking. So, yeah, all right. So let's move on to talking more about child abuse and developmental trauma and how that is hidden. He says that at the end of chapter 9, he says it's really like the most expensive thing that we deal with if we're talking about the economics of things. that he said, if we were to eradicate child abuse, we would reduce the overall depression by more than half, alcoholism by 2/3, suicide, IV, drug use, and domestic violence by 3/4. It would also have a dramatic effect on the workplace performance and vastly decrease the need for incarceration. So he's kind of making these economic arguments too. All right. So, and still insurance is a problem. Yeah. So he begins in the next one to talk about, in chapter 10, developmental trauma. So he talks about nature and nurture. He does this study with monkeys, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then he talks about trying to get a DSM diagnosis. And Diane is pointing out that insurance is a problem. Yeah, I mean, part of the way our medical system works is to have insurance cover certain things. You have to have a diagnosis. And so but then when you get a diagnosis, if you're treating that diagnosis, perhaps you're actually mistreating, as we were talking about, if you're diagnosed with, say, the one of these personality disorders, but the underlying issue is traumatic trauma. Well, you can treat that disorder, but not treat the trauma, and then you still have a problem. Or, you're diagnosed with obesity, and so you get treated for that, and then you begin to cut yourself. So it's tricky. All right. So, okay. So genetics. So he talks about monkeys and nature and nurture, and he looks at so these monkeys who had mothers who weren't great mothers, basically. So he said that so he talks about the importance of socialization. Monkeys are social creatures, they're mammals. And he says that independent play with peers is the primary way that monkeys learn to get along in life. So the study looks at what happens with that peer play given their mother and the way their mother treated them. So he says that when you start out with an anxious monkey and an angry monkey, so you take the anxious monkey, and he says when you put the anxious monkey in a stable social group where she is nurtured and kind of socialized, when she has a baby monkey, usually she will become a pretty diligent mom who really takes care of her baby. The aggressive monkey mom, putting them in a social group didn't help because they pushed all the people away. They were punitive with their babies. They would hit them, kick them, bite them, all of those things. And they would keep the baby monkeys away from their monkey baby peers. So he says, so then what they did is they did this experiment where they removed the babies from their mothers at birth and put them with peers that they could be attached to see what happened. Okay. He said that it was a problem. He said that they would cling to each other. They wouldn't explore in healthy play. There was no imagination that's typical for monkeys. There was no complexity in how they played. He said these monkeys grew up to be really uptight, and the peer-raised monkeys, not mama-raised monkeys, but peer-raised monkeys would overreact to minor stress. And he said, so what's this? Oh, and then the cortisol study was there. He said the cortisol increases as much more in response to loud noises than in monkeys that were raised by their mothers. And the serotonin metabolism was even more abnormal than those of monkeys who are genetically predisposed to aggression, but who were raised by their own mothers. So he said the conclusion is that early experience has just as much, at least as much impact on your biology as your heredity does. So in other words, nature and nurture are important, but your chemistry, your brain chemistry, your cortisol and all that stuff is also impacted by how you're nurtured. And I think he's arguing again that you need a nurturing parent. You need a nurturing caregiver. So he said, children, human children who grow up with attuned and attentive parents are not gonna, they're less likely to develop genetic problems that might predispose them to depression and that kind of thing. So he said, like, if you have that gene in your family, but I think I've got this right. If you have that gene in your family, but you're well taken care of by your family, you have an attentive caregiver, that you're probably going to be okay. But if you have an abusive parent or caregiver, then you're probably not going to be okay. So that's that. Then he begins to talk about the National Child Traumatic Stress Network that they put together to really study and help traumatized children. And his work with like trying to form this kind of started in 1998, but he said it didn't really exist until 2001, which seems not that long ago and ridiculous. So he said so this is an advocacy group. There was not an advocacy group for childhood traumatic stress until 2001, which is awful. That's not that long ago. So, all right. So he said, it's really important to get a diagnosis to capture the reality of a traumatized person's experience, a traumatized child's experience. And when you don't have that diagnosis, it's really, really hard to give the proper treatment. So he goes on and on about this. And he says that the developmental trauma disorder that they tried to get a label for consists of three things. This is the profile. 1, a pervasive pattern of dysregulation. 2, problems with attention and concentration. And 3, difficulties getting along with themselves and others. And it didn't get passed. It's super, super awful and sad. And then he begins to talk about numbing and sexual abuse and all of those things. And he said all of this becomes a snowball when you're abused as a young girl. Then your sex hormones develop, all that stuff develops earlier, and you don't trust and you feel numb, so you're not gonna necessarily fight things off, and so you're more likely to be abused again, and everything just snowballs. All right, friends, I am gonna admit that I totally didn't finish outlining my thoughts, and I want to go back to some of the great things that you said, but I'm looking at the clock and it is 5:40, and I actually have another book study that I'm supposed to be leading for my church like right now, and my sweet people are waiting for me to open up the Zoom room. So I'm gonna head off there, but please keep the discussion going here, and on Thursday we're gonna go to chapters 11 and 12. All right, friends, thanks for being patient and have a wonderful Tuesday.